Picture that you're standing on a black volcanic rock that you watched form with your own eyes. You remember the year it happened, and you can pull up the photos, and you could talk to people who were there. You could literally point to the timeline in human history, and then somebody runs a lab test and calmly tells you, uh, this rock is millions of years old. That moment right there is where a lot of people either shut down and say science is fake, or they bow down and say the Bible must be wrong. But what if neither of those reactions is the right move? What if the real lesson is simpler and scarier at the same time? What if our dating methods are not a stopwatch? What if in certain conditions, they're more like a thermometer? They tell you something real, but only if you understand what the environment was doing when the reading was taken, and only if you admit the limits of what the tool was designed to measure. Let's walk through this slow and clean, because this is one of the most important things to understand if you're trying to honestly weigh scripture, history, and what we can actually prove in the natural world. When scientists date rocks with certain radiometric methods, they're not reading the age label stamped into a stone. They're measuring the ratio between a parent element and a daughter element, and then they're converting that ratio into a time estimate by assuming a few foundational things stayed true. Assuming. One of the biggest assumptions is that when rock formed, the clock started at 0, meaning the rock had the parent isotope, but it did not already contain extra daughter products trapped inside it. Another big assumption is that the rock stayed a closed system after it formed, meaning it didn't gain or lose those isotopes over time. Another assumption is that the decay environment stayed stable enough that the measured ratios still map to time in a straightforward way. Now here's where it gets intense. In the real world, especially with volcanic rocks, those assumptions aren't always true, and scientists have known this for a long time. A famous example used in the debate is potassium-argon dating on very young lava. Argon is a gas. Gas can behave in complicated ways inside magma. When magma is deep underground, under pressure, gases can be dissolved and trapped. Then when it erupts and cools, some of the gas can remain locked inside minerals as excess argon. If you test that rock later, the instrument can interpret that trapped argon as though it took a long time to accumulate by decay, even if the rock is young. This isn't a spooky conspiracy. Excess argon is a real, published, recognized phenomenon in geochronology, and it's one reason certain dating techniques aren't intended for dating brand new rocks. So why do you see results where known age rocks come back with wildly old ages? Because the test is measuring chemistry and then converting it into time using assumptions that can fail, especially in young volcanic material, especially when the daughter product can be present at formation, and especially when the system isn't behaving like a sealed jar. Here's a clean way to understand it without getting lost. If I were to bake a cake and then somebody tries to guess how long it has been baking based on how brown the crust is, that method might work if every oven is the same and every cake recipe is the same and the heat stayed constant the whole time. But if the oven was hotter, or the ingredients were different, or the cake was already warm when it went in, then you can get a totally wrong answer. The crust color is real. The conclusion about time is where the assumptions can break. Now let's take the next step. Even if we grant that many radiometric dates can be internally consistent under stable conditions, the Bible describes a world-changing event that would be the definition of unstable conditions. It describes a global catastrophe with the breaking open of all fountains of the great deep and the opening of the windows of the heavens. That's not just rainfall. That's earth source water, sky source water, and the kind of violent planetary reshaping that would change oceans, sediments, chemistry, and the way materials get buried. Genesis 7:11 says it plainly. Fountains broke open and the windows opened. And after the flood, everything about human life changes. Lifespans drop. The world the patriarchs lived in before the flood is not the world that comes after. Those lifespans aren't a minor detail. Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 read like a countdown of human longevity. People lived for centuries before the flood, then the numbers begin collapsing afterward. That's not proof, of atmospheric pressure or oxygen by itself, but it's direct biblical evidence that the pre-flood world was not basically today, but with more rain. It was very different. And here's the line we have to draw, because you asked for proven science, not hypothetical guesses. That's what we need. We can't put a thermometer into the pre-flood sky and read out the exact oxygen percentage or atmospheric pressure. No human can. The Bible doesn't give a number, and modern science can't directly sample that world. So anyone acting like they can quote an exact pre-flood oxygen percent is overreaching. But we can say something very important with confidence. We do know from multiple independent scientific lines of evidence that Earth's atmosphere has not always been exactly what it is today. Oxygen has varied significantly over long spans of time. That's not religious. That's mainstream Earth science. Modeling of Earth's carbon and sulfur cycles suggests oxygen has varied roughly between about 15 and 30% over the last 550 million years. And how do scientists know oxygen has changed if they didn't have a gas meter 300 million years ago? One major clue is fossil charcoal. Fire requires oxygen. There's a minimum oxygen level below which widespread wildfire is hard to sustain. The fact that charcoal is present in many layers through Earth's history tells you oxygen was high enough to support burning. Researchers have used charcoal evidence and modeling to discuss oxygen levels and fire behavior across deep time. This is why you'll even see mainstream sources talk about periods like the Carboniferous having substantially higher oxygen than today, and they connect that to the size of some insects and the intensity of wildfire potential. So right there we have a solid scientific anchor. Atmospheric composition can change, and those changes would affect biology and the environment. And here comes the suspenseful part, because this is where the pieces click together. If the atmosphere and environment can change across time, and the Bible describes the biggest environmental reset in human history, then it's not crazy at all to say this. You can't take modern day assumptions and force them backwards across a world resetting catastrophe and pretend the clock settings stayed the same. That doesn't work. That doesn't mean every dating result is always wrong. It means you shouldn't treat the method like it's 100% absolute truth independent of history. And that brings us back to your original point about dating methods not being 100% accurate. If the assumptions are violated, the output can be dramatically wrong. And even the scientific literature recognizes specific issues like excess argon in volcanic rocks. So what's the takeaway for a Bible-believing person who also respects real science? A dating method can tell you real information about chemical processes, but converting that into a calendar date requires assumptions about starting conditions and system behavior. When Scripture describes a planet-wide upheaval that would alter starting conditions and system behavior, you should be extremely cautious about treating any single method as an absolute timeline ruler for everything. Now let's bring this back to why this matters spiritually without turning it into trust me bro claims. Jesus treated Noah as real history. Scripture treats the flood as an actual event that reshaped the world. So when you're evaluating timelines, you shouldn't be shocked if the modern world's measurement tools struggle when they're trying to read a world that went through a global reset. And that's why, as believers, we don't have to fear science, and we don't have to worship it either. Definitely not. We can respect measurement and still recognize assumptions. We can look at the sky, the rocks, the layers, and the fossils and say, this world has a history. And then we can look at Scripture and say, God already told us the biggest chapter. Now let me hit you up with a practical point that makes this go from interesting to personal. If your worldview is built on whatever the lab says is automatically the full truth, then you can be manipulated by any confident sounding number. But if your worldview is built on truth, you learn to ask one simple question every time you hear a date. What assumptions had to be true for that number to be true? And if the assumptions aren't guaranteed, then the number isn't guaranteed. That's not anti-science. That's actually scientific thinking. Now, if you do want the full breakdown with this pre-flood world in Scripture, the post-flood changes in the cleanest way to explain why the environment matters for interpreting measurements, drop a comment that says starting conditions, and share this with one person who always says the science settled it without ever asking what the science assumes. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what we got coming up next. God bless y'all and your families. God bless this world and these United States. Shalom, shalom, brothers and sisters. Maranatha.